Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you again to the organizer, the university, the foundation, of course, for giving me the possibility to share with you some aspects of the work I have been doing. Hopefully, yeah, my goal, my aim for this 15, 20 minutes is actually to share some ideas, some aspects, to give you a sense of the work collected in the volume, but also for the discussion we can have afterwards. So I have been asked to say something about the origin of the book, the methodology, some contents, and definitely how this work actually helps a dialogue between philosophy and science mainly, and to some extent with theology as well. When I was studying in a university biology in Milan, I was told that biology was to be understood as the combination of bios and logos, so that life and the principle of order and knowledge. This approach to the biological world changed when I started studying philosophy. So from here, it was long time ago, right? To here, when teaching in Campus Biomedico, which is still my university. So the strong commitment to believe that the scientific method and the peculiarity of its explanatory enterprise provided the explanatory framework for all biological phenomena strongly contrasted with my experience in the lab at that time already, thinking of the conversation I had with my professors, with my colleagues. So in that period, I realized already that a double dimension with philosophical relevance was at stake. One was related with experimental design, and the other one with the deconceptualization, the very conceptualization of living organisms. And cancer research is a result at that time already a very good example of how science needs philosophy. As we will see, the obstacles encountered are posed not only by the complexity of cancer itself, right? You can recognize this picture, but also with the deep fragmentation of knowledge and by the peculiar specialization of mechanistic biology, which is still the mainstream, talking about mainstream this morning, right, in biological sciences. So becoming familiar with the scientific and philosophical literature, little by little I realized that the scientists, not only contemporary philosophers, had assumed naturalism and mechanism as the privileged theoretical framework for tackling the challenge of biological complexity. This led to a molecularized understanding of life and of its dynamics. I finally had to dig into the foundation and past reasons of reductionism, well represented by the question about the lowest possible level of explanation of a biological phenomenon and what should be considered more fundamental in explanatory terms. To give a concrete example of the kind of tensions that were generated that I have been looking at, right, in cancer literature, we can have a look at this picture in which are represented different ways of understanding cancer. Just to say something briefly, if you think that 40 years ago, more or less, cancer was mainly understood as a thing. Cancer was a mass of cell. We can treat it with surgery, mainly. But now, more recently, cancer has been understood more and more as a process. And now, we do know that the main challenge we have to face with in cancer is the huge heterogeneity of tumor cells. Yesterday we listened, very nice presentation on this, so I won't spend more time on this kind of examples. But what is clear that within a reductionist perspective, it's really hard to make sense of these different perspectives on cancer itself. Another example is the evolution of the explanatory models of cancer. I think that all of us, when we were kids, right, we were used to think of cancer in terms of a genetic disease. And that was the main narrative, right, we have learned. So we have a cell, we have a mutation, which is a specific event that is changing the behavior of a cell. So we end up with a tumor cells that shows some kind of drug resistance as well. So this is a linear narrative. But people working at that time already, so in the 80s, right, realized that this was even simpler than we reductionists had dared to hope for. So they started recognizing that other molecules and other genes and other epigenetic factors, metabolic factors were involved. And they came up with a picture like this, still with a linear narrative, as you can see, where all the factors were necessary and sufficient. Pay attention to this kind of language, right? And they ended up reconstructing the overall structure of the cell. So they went back to the very structure they tried to simplify at the very beginning, right? So here we have a problem, right? At least we have a tension. We have a real tension. And I always like to quote Einstein at this point, saying, make things as simple as possible, but not more. So at that time, my interest was precisely to understand what but not more amounted to. I thus discussed in the volume how a wider and different understanding of scientific practice and of living entities allows us to go deeper in the biological dynamics, looking for more integrated models for intervention, and especially, and I think this is so important for the discussion we wanted to have today, to make sense of our best scientific results. The idea is, as we can also quote John Dupré on this, that there is much more beyond the science than science itself. At this point, it is easier, at least, to understand the methodology I decided to adopt, right? Going deeper in this kind of papers, showing that there are paradoxes and that we have to take those paradoxes seriously to make some advance. The idea is that if we are interested in exploring the assumptions and methods underlying the sciences, we need both to explore the theories and results produced by scientists and the processes by which they come to these conclusions. So assuming that providing an explanation of an outcome is to some extent providing information about causes, you remember now all the talks that we have already listening to, right? It's easy to understand why the strategy I adopt is this one. Rather than asking general theoretical questions about the appropriate scientific standards for evidence, recasting the questions of interest in terms of activities allowed me to explore various approaches to the generation and weighting of scientific evidence. As you can see from this statement, right, the human factor was really important in the kind of analysis I have been performing. So in the first place, there are three theses, right, that follow this kind of strategy. The first one is that interpretation is always part of the scientific endeavor, and that in such interpretation, philosophical backgrounds do play a role in the way scientists actually present and discuss their data. Secondly, that scientific practice does not merely depend on a logical process of justifications. And finally, that when scientists are not open to the metaphysical dimension of reality, it is difficult for them to appreciate the relevance of their own discoveries and advances. So an example of this would be teleological explanation, the irreversibility of many biological processes, and definitely the striking functional integration we can see in the biological organism all the time that ask for a very specific understanding of living systems that cannot be completely naturalized. To appreciate this, we need to drop a reductionist viewpoint on science, which searches for a unified and privileged explanatory model of the world, and its rigid association with what should be considered the adequate methodology to be adopted. So now we have a couple of slides representing the epistemological and the ontological outcomes, right, of this kind of approach and study. Here on the left, don't get lost in all of those words, is just cartoons representing the different sections of the book. So I first analyzed different models. I went deeper into the biology of cancer, trying to understand and making sense of a convergence of different explanatory models of the neoplastic process, and advancing some thesis about how scientists actually work and are able to find real and relevant explanatory models. So the idea is that when scientists work well, honestly, right, they can get to relational structures that are able to relate macroscopic and microscopic elements, right? Something that is now already known in literature as a mesoscopic way of reasoning. I don't know if some of you are already familiar with this kind of language, but you can easily find it now in Frontiers or other journals like that. And from an ontological point of view, we can definitely say that the hypothesis advanced in the book is that a biological entity acts as a dynamic multi-unity rather than a part-whole organization. This means that a cell changes their behavior depending on their functional integration in the tissue. The structure, the biological structure, the macroenvironment, once constituted, determines the relationships among parts and the stability of the parts themselves. Unity is thus an essential feature of any biological system, dynamic in nature, that is revealed by the way of integration of its organization and growth. In fact, the unity we are talking about is a unity of action that exceeds other categories that may seem similar, such as unity of a system or organismal individuality, like is much more common to find in philosophical literature on life or on living organism. But definitely, what is important here is that in this way, it seems easier to make sense of the most fundamental phenomenology we see in cancer. And that's why we still call all the different diseases cancer, right? Which is because in cancer, all the levels of the biological organization are at some point compromised. So we have to to account for these kind of dependencies, which are very peculiar. And that's why we still call cancer cancer, right? Although we treat them somehow in different ways. But this asks for moving beyond mereological and atomistic views of living beings and entities, which is vital in order, first, to understand the complex diseases and to make sense of progressive convergence of explanatory models, and thirdly, to drive biological research for the years to come, also for not only from a technological point of view, but also thinking of our understanding, right, of biomedicine and of complex diseases. Here we have a slide that is just summarizing what I have been saying up to now. Let's just focus on the third column, in which are summarized two epistemological aspects that I think are crucial to understand hopefully the relevance of this kind of approaches. The first one is the need of widening the notion we use of causality in science to account for this kind of dependencies and dynamics, and also the heuristic role that the intrinsic normativity of living systems have in helping us to understand this kind of phenomena. This is something we already heard in some other presentation during these days. This slide is just for philosophers, so you are excused if you want just to fall asleep and just to... But this is an interesting one, I think, because the relational ontology, the overall view I'm proposing in the volume, is actually able to avoid the danger of transforming a methodology into an ontology, as it has been in life sciences and in philosophy of life within a mechanistic and reductionist view, perspective, to avoid introducing mere epistemic criteria to solve issues that were metaphysical in nature, explain why scientific knowledge can be objective without fitting the criteria of universality and necessity typical of classical mechanistic explanation. This is a strong statement, I know, but this is very interesting too, and to overcome the dualistic view of a scientific rationality. So now I just wanted to thank people and places that have been important in my life. And this is Sylvie Menard. She was my director in the labs when I worked. Do you remember the first picture when I was a young person? She encouraged me all the time to ask the right question and not to look for easy answer, right? And this is another place where I worked for a couple, 2-3 years. I met a lot of people there. I didn't agree with them, the majority part of, in many occasions, from a scientific point of view and definitely from an ethical point of view. But still, it was really interesting having this kind of conversation with them, because it was clear that God is part of every one fundamental question and is to some extent relevant for our scientific endeavors as well. And finally, well, not really finally, but definitely in those years, Cardinals Grecia and Monsignor Carrasco, they were really of great help. They told me, Marta, if you are daring enough to go deeper in this analysis, in this research, you will end up like Alice in Wonderland. So, and this is in fact, I think that this is, very. Life is precisely like that. So I'm still getting lost and, and trying to make sense of different things, and definitely trusting science and especially human beings in their scientific challenges. And finally, Pittsburgh, as I already said maybe yesterday at different points, but Sandy Mitchell always encouraged me, and which is, and this is very important in the philosophical field, I think, to say, she always said, Marta, say what you want to say. And in this sense, try to be simple, right? So, and trying to be simple, I'm just closing my presentation here. I don't want to take your time. Here you have a list of the impact of the book, and just want to focus on the fourth one, which is this opportunity that I will be happy to share with you all, of using this Springer series for other publications that can expand the objectives of this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bertolaso. Now we'll go to Professor Robert Enright, who speaks on forgiveness therapy, and on behalf also of his colleague, Dr. Fitzgibbons, who couldn't join us today.
Thank you very much, Max, and thank you to all of you for being here. I know you and I have not formally met, but I know you. And I know you, and I know you, and I know you, and I know every one of you. And I know every one of you much more deeply than you realize. Want me to prove it to you? You have a hurting heart. Someone at some time in your life has broken your heart. And I know that. And if we went around the room and shared that story that you have, it would make some of us weep. And that's why I study what I do. I study forgiveness because it deals with and acknowledges the broken heart. And do you realize nobody in the entire history of the social sciences has asked that question about how you heal from a broken heart through forgiveness ever until we started studying it in 1985? And I started studying it because I was sick and tired of my topic of moral development, which was very good to me. I studied how children and adolescents think about justice, because that's the only thing people were studying in moral development at the time. And it was, oh, so interesting. So I threw it all over the cliff, and I asked an opposite question, not about how you be just, but what you do when you're treated unjustly. And the topic of forgiveness kept coming up for me. And I realized nobody ever had published an article on empirical data connected with forgiveness. So it gave me a career, gave me a very interesting career, because as soon as I started studying it at a non-religious secular university, I realized how touchy the subject was. People didn't like me anymore, okay? Because I wasn't a good boy anymore. I wasn't doing what they expected me to do. And I was doing something they considered weak or religious and unreasonable. But I knew it was important because it was dealing with the broken heart. And so I developed a group from many areas of the world of graduate students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I'm a professor. And we started asking 3 questions. What is forgiveness? How do you do it? And what happens when you forgive? I'm a slow learner. I've been on that ever since. Right? I'm still trying to figure that out. And so in this talk, I want to talk with you about these themes, especially as the Congress here really focuses in terms of the interdisciplinary nature of the topic of forgiveness. So we're going to talk about human anthropology, epistemology. We're going to talk about ethics of forgiveness, and we're going to talk about the quest for meaning. So let's start with the anthropological question to try and understand what forgiveness is to help your broken heart. All right? The first basic question of human anthropology is, who are we as human beings? Who are you? Do you know what I have come to realize in studying forgiveness? When people have a broken heart, they tend to believe the lie that they are less than they should be. Most people come to me who have been crushed by others, and they don't like themselves, and they don't understand the truth of human anthropology, which is every one of us are made in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, every one of us have inherent or built-in worth, and you are of great value. You are special, unique, and irreplaceable, even with a hurting heart. And that anthropology is also in the secular realm. Immanuel Kant from the 1700s said, every human being is an end in and of themselves and should be treated as such. Right? We know biblically we are to love others how? As we love ourselves. Christians know that you are so valuable, even though you may have been crushed by others, that Christ died for you. And if you were the only person left on this earth, he would have died for you. Right? But you know, when people are crushed by others, they stop believing that. They stop thinking that way. And so we have to recapture true human anthropology. And that's what forgiveness does. And forgiveness, when we push it to its philosophical limits, tells us this about who the human being is. That means you are capable of love. You are capable of recapturing love, even though love has been taken away from you. And that's the goal of forgiveness. The end point of forgiveness as a human being is to love even when others aren't loving you. To have the heroic capacity and the strength to go ahead and love. We know through Aristotelian philosophy that all of us practice love imperfectly. And we all practice love in different ways. And some of us might even reject the idea of trying to love those who don't love us. But I can hear Aristotle whispering in my ear, that's okay. That's still the goal. That's still the end point of the human condition, to do that. And so forgiveness, as we talk about in the book Forgiveness Therapy, is to understand that and then to practice it. What about this theme called epistemology, which is how we learn? Well, we've learned through the scientific method. We've worked with incest survivors, people in drug rehabilitation, adolescents whose parents have neglected them. We're working now with acid burn victims, women in Pakistan, right? We just got done with 3 different kind of groups in Iran who are having prejudicial fights with one another. Right? We've worked with the elderly dying of cancer and helped them to forgive. And in our epistemology, or our science, when we lead people to forgive, you know what happens? They end up liking themselves more. They end up reducing anger. They end up reducing frustration. This little glimmer, philosophically, it will grow a little bit at a time. There's a little glimmer of love, of compassion that begins to grow in your heart, paradoxically, toward those who have hurt you. But to even begin to help people epistemologically to go there, we have to know what forgiveness is philosophically. What is it? The short version is to struggle to be good to those who aren't good to you. Right? A little bit more formally, there are 3 parts to the definition of forgiveness that I see in ancient Greece, Hebrew, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and Confucian philosophies, and it's this. I think they would all agree to this. First, you've been treated unjustly. Then you struggle to get rid of resentment, which is a persistent ill will to those who have crushed you, and you try to offer goodness to them. The strongest part of that goodness is love, or agape love, A-G-A-P-E, agape love, which is suffering love, where you love on behalf of the other even when it hurts. Thomas Aquinas taught me that. All right? And so that's what forgiveness is. Philosophically, we also have to know what it's not. When we forgive, we don't excuse what the other did. We try to love them as persons. We try to accept ourselves and our brokenness as persons, but we don't excuse the behavior. We don't automatically reconcile if the person is dangerous to us. And we don't abandon the quest for justice. We have to know this, because otherwise people sit there and they say forgiveness is for, to use an American expression, wimps. Forgiveness is weak. No, you stand strongly in the knowledge that someone was unfair to you, they've hurt you, and you try to love them, not what they've done. Then psychologically, in terms of our getting to know what forgiveness is, here is the pathway, because that's what psychology does. The pathway of forgiving is basically this. First, you recognize you've been treated unjustly and you courageously acknowledge your pain. You acknowledge you may be angry or sad. You acknowledge you've been disrupted. And then you make a decision, a free will decision. Forgiveness is never forced on anybody, whether to go ahead or not, and to forgive. And if you do, then we enter into the exercises of forgiveness. And the first is to try and recapture the humanity of the other by seeing them in their errors, seeing them in their own woundedness, seeing them as children of God, right? See them as at least capable of good. And then the heart starts to soften, we see, with some compassion toward those who have had no compassion on you. And then we stand in the pain. We bear the pain of what happened to us so we don't pass the pain back to the person who hurt us or to our loved ones. Because you know what I have found in studying forgiveness for 34 years? When your heart is broken and you are disrupted inside, it's very easy to pass that on to your loved ones who weren't the ones who hurt you. When you can stand in the pain and see the humanity in the other person, it is then that you paradoxically begin to heal. You begin to recapture your own humanity. You begin to ask yourself this question: who am I as a person? If I can stand in this pain and offer goodness to those who have not been good to me, am I also someone who is of worth? And the answer typically is yes. And when we see that happening, what we're engaging in is the ethics of love. As we practice the ethics of love and are consciously aware of that, applied to the one who has no love toward us, we tend to grow in that heroic aspect of love. It's very easy to love a 6-year-old who's hugging your leg. It's not so easy to love those who have crushed you. That's what we mean by agape love. And do you see how theology now fits into forgiveness? Those of you who are Christian have the image of a dying Christ who did nothing wrong and unconditionally is loving you back to him. Do you know what you're doing when you're forgiving deeply that way? You are becoming Christ-like for the other. St. John Paul II told me that in his apostolic letter, Salvifici Doloris. You are redemptively suffering for the one who has hurt you. And do you realize the pain they gave you, if you can redemptively suffer, just might help save them? The ethic of forgiveness is profound because it's the heroic expression of love. Right? Which leads us then to the idea of meaning, which is important to the expanded reasoning Congress. That's part of the process of forgiveness. It's not just seeing the other as human, developing compassion, standing in the pain. It's also giving the gift of love, but it's also finding new meaning in your suffering. Because your suffering now, St. John Paul II tells me, has been linked to love. When you suffer, you are now doing this for a particular meaning, which is to put more love in the world. And do you realize that when you have a broken heart and you decide to forgive, and you go through this process, you might be developing an entirely new legacy for yourself. That's new meaning. And you know what that legacy is? Consciously and willingly deciding to leave more love in this world rather than anger when you die. I work in war-torn lands. I work in the Middle East. I work in Belfast, Northern Ireland. I help in Liberia, Africa. I see anger passed on through the generations. The legacy many people leave when they have a broken heart is anger to their children. You have an opportunity by heroically standing in the pain and trying ethically to love those who have not loved you, to leave that legacy of love to others. You can start that today, actually. I'm glad you're here. Right? That could be your new legacy. And just finally, I want you to know that through this book, Forgiveness Therapy, we have had a ton of opportunities. Here's just a few of them. My colleague Richard Fitzgibbons is beginning to show the psychiatric community that resentment, what they call irritability, is something that has been ignored too much in the psychiatric community. Learning how to get rid of that can help people get rid of depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem. We have had a forgiveness conference in Jerusalem and in Rome, and these are videos now on our International Forgiveness Institute website. You're welcome to look at these. We have now been invited to work with the Missionaries of Charity, Saint Mother Teresa's group, because they're beginning to see the usefulness of forgiveness within their own community and for the homeless. We are beginning to work with cancer patients, with blood cancers, because one physician in the United Kingdom is beginning to see that when people have been hurt by others and they're struggling with blood cancers, when they can get rid of the resentment, the symptoms of the disease level out. Right? We are beginning to work on something called road rage, where people oftentimes take out their anger on others on the road. And we're beginning to work in prisons. You know why we're working in prisons? Because we find those who commit the worst crimes, 90% of them have been hurt gravely, deeply by other people prior to their crimes. And so what they do is take that out on others. We're helping them to forgive those who've hurt them when they're 6, 7, or 8 years old. We have a lot more to do with forgiveness because the world is still sleepy with regard to the topic. It is, I think, the most neglected moral virtue on the planet, and I think it's the most heroic. And so I challenge you for 2 things. First, work on your own broken heart, and then leave a legacy of love. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Enright. These two were our 2 recipients of the Expanded Reason Awards research category. Now I will invite Professor Bruno Dick from the Asper School of Business to address us. He's an expert on management, and he's the recipient of the Teaching Award this year.
Hello there, and it's very nice to be here again. It's very nice to have a little bit of time to share with you some of the things that I've been doing in the classroom and in my teaching writing career also. I'm going to start off sort of with the punchline. Here's where I ended up, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story about how I got there. So I'm a business professor, and my most recent book looks at 3 different types of management. It looks at FBL management, which is financial bottom line management, which is organizations making as much money as they can. That's been the dominant paradigm for the last 100 years or so. It's based on consequential utilitarian ethics. The second flavor is triple bottom line management, which says there's 3 important things. There's the triple bottom line refers to financial well-being, social well-being, and ecological well-being. It's sometimes called the 3 Ps, people, planet, and profit. And that's become the dominant paradigm starting about 1990. And we heard this morning about we're discussing somewhere about the round table in the United States saying we're going to be moving towards that. Unfortunately, the triple bottom line approach doesn't do enough. The FBL, financial bottom line management, has created a lot of social and ecological crises that the triple bottom line is trying to resolve. But the reality is that the largest 3,000 corporations on the planet are still creating $2 trillion of negative ecological externalities a year. That's about $300 a person on the planet. And it's the rich people who can afford those that are benefiting from that, and the ones who can't aren't. And that's why there's a widening gap between the rich and the poor. So the first 2 flavors of management. The TBL management based on enlightened consequential utilitarian ethics. The third approach, which we call social and ecological thought, SET management, seeks to optimize social and ecological well-being while making enough money. What is enough? It's a good question. I want my students to think about that. While making enough money. SET management is based on virtue ethics. Because it doesn't maximize profits, it has more degrees of freedom to do things that enhance social and ecological well-being. Whereas in the triple bottom line approach, it's still financial well-being is the first among equals. There's always a business case to be social and ecologically responsible. We should have a daycare because we're going to have less turnover and we're going to reduce our costs and we're going to have more motivated workforce. We should have less packaging on our products because it's going to save us money. That's the TBL approach. SET management says we're going to do this right even if it costs us more money. A great example would be Grayston Bakery. It's a bakery in New York City where they deliberately hire anybody who walks through the door. So they hire ex-convicts, people who can't get a job elsewhere. And because they hire those people, they become included in society. And they become part of the community, and they're saving money. We're not going to recidivism anymore. They're not going back to jail, most of them. It's not the company that's saving the money, it's society that's saving that money. The motto at Grayston Bakery is, we don't hire people to bake brownies, we bake brownies to hire people. Set management is still countercultural, or it comes across as countercultural, but it's clearly consistent with emerging trends in both the scholarly literature and among practitioners, and especially among young people. After business students learn about these three approaches to management, 5% self-identify as FBL managers. These are business students. 5% say it's important to maximize money. 75% say it's a triple bottom line. We can make more money by taking care of the social and ecological environment. 20% of business students say, we're going to go with set management. That's the one that resonates with us. We're going to make the world a better place, even though it might not maximize money. I find that encouraging. So that's a bit the punchline, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I got there. I'll start by responding to a question we were given, namely to reflect a bit on how our work relates to the dialogue between faith and reason, and also to provide a short description of biographical events that led us to where we are now. So let me start by saying that my work has clearly been shaped by my childhood home. I was raised in the suburbs of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, by parents who were European immigrants who took their Mennonite faith very seriously. Mennonites are a Christian denomination known for their emphasis on community, nonviolent resistance, and the separation of church and state. Mennonites began in Europe in the 1500s and have been described as countercultural radicals, neither Protestant nor Catholic. For my parents, Christian values were not something to be emphasized only on Sundays, but something that should influence all of life, both at home and at work. My father was an entrepreneur who started a kitchen cabinet factory, so I grew up quite aware of the importance of integrating one's values with how one does business. Thus, when I was an undergraduate business student, I remember feeling uncomfortable in those classes about the utilitarian assumptions that were underlying everything that was being taught to me. And even back then, I was writing papers that were questioning the mainstream approach to business, and I was looking for countercultural examples. For example, in my marketing course, I wrote a paper that said, this textbook has self-destructed. It starts off with these noble intentions of serving society's needs, and then it sort of says we have to stimulate people's wants, and by the end it says we have to force people to buy the stuff that we're selling them. It wasn't just the marketing courses that I had problems with. I took a course called Technological Entrepreneurship, for which I wrote a paper, Success and Jesus of Nazareth. I was a little bit apprehensive about writing that paper for a public university. In the paper, I examined whether Jesus, as portrayed in the Gospels, was a success based on the criteria that we had learned in class. I concluded the paper as follows, quote, when I undertook this project, I did not fully realize how challenging I would find it. Although I conclude that Jesus was a successful person, there are many ways in which I personally see him as an antithesis of success. Instead of waiting to be served by others, Jesus served others throughout and ultimately with his life. He introduced what has been referred to as an upside-down kingdom. His is an inverted worldview, where the last are first and enemies are loved. This contrasts quite starkly with the North American worldview of successful living. End of quote. Fast forward, and exactly 30 years after writing these words, as an undergraduate business student, I published a book that examined the countercultural understanding of success and management as portrayed in the life of Jesus as described in the book of Luke. In the book, I examine the Gospel of Luke in its first century socioeconomic and religious context, and in particular, I look at its implications for management theory and practice for both the first and for the 21st centuries. But this is not the time to get into details about that book. If I had to summarize it in a sentence, it would be that we all are, to care for people at the margins of society, to take into account what economists call externalities of business, and to treat everyone with dignity. And these are all ideas that I think are consistent with expanded reason and with social and ecological thought. Okay, back to Bruno the teacher here. In order to understand my teaching innovations, it's also helpful to understand how my pedagogical approach went from having an emphasis on knowing, where students learn important facts about management, to adding an emphasis on doing, where students apply their knowledge, to an emphasis on being, where students focus on what kind of manager they want to become by considering questions such as those related with the expanded reason paradigm. Knowing, doing, being. So when I first started teaching management in 1990 with a freshly minted PhD in business, I thought I had a lot of relevant state-of-the-art knowledge to share. However, it didn't take long for me to find out that both for me and my students, knowing was not fully engaging. So I started to develop the doing component of my teaching. For example, I wrote up what I call live cases, namely short descriptions of real-world local organizations which I asked students to analyze and then present their analyses to the managers of those organizations who'd come to class. Often I chose organizations that were seeking to make the world a better place, like a soup kitchen that sought to treat its clients with dignity, or a thrift shop that provided goods for unwed mothers. In this way, students were using their knowledge to help make the world a better place, rather than merely using it to become more efficient or more productive. More recently, I've added to the doing part of the course by having students complete what I call experiments with sustainability. Here, students are assigned to take ideas that we've learned about in the course and apply them to their everyday lives for 2 weeks or more. Some students start to walk or cycle everywhere because they don't want to use fossil fuels. Other students become vegetarian because they know meat has problems with climate change also. Others decide to engage on daily meditation in order to improve their mental health, mental well-being. These are all things they're doing that make life less convenient. You're not supposed to do it, the market says, but by the end of the experiment, their students are saying, that was good. Being countercultural made me feel like a more whole person. Over time, I've also started to change the knowing parts of the course. And in particular, I started to develop the course content that pointed out to the shortcomings of FBL management and which showed glimpses of the TBL and SET approaches. In the early years, I did that on a piecemeal approach. Oh, here's reductionism, not so good. Or here's why consumerism is bad. So I had these little windows in the course that I thought would show students, hey, there's another way of managing other than the FBL way. However, soon I was not satisfied with this piecemeal approach, and I devoted myself to developing a more comprehensive countercultural approach to management. 3 factors contributed to this. First, my students wanted me to do it. Second, at the time I was doing research on managers who are marching to the beat of a different drum. They had been nominated because they're interesting people doing things not just to make as much money as possible. Those are inspiring and enlightening. And third, I was reading Alistair McIntyre at the time on virtue ethics. Taken together, these 3 factors encouraged me to write what I sometimes call my Theology of Management paper with a theologian named David Schrader. In that paper, we argue that management is essentially a moral activity and that any and every approach to management can be associated with an underpinning moral point of view. We then argue that FBL management can be associated with a secularized moral point of view consistent with a Weberian interpretation of the Protestant ethic that emphasizes individualism and materialism, where financial well-being is seen as a sign of being blessed by God. In contrast, in our paper, we draw on Mennonite Anabaptist theology to posit an alternative moral point of view that is less materialistic and less individualistic, which gives rise to an alternative approach to management, one that is more consistent with virtue ethics. Happily, this Theology of Management paper was published in a top management journal, which provided a strong scholarly foundation for a series of textbooks on management and organizational behavior. I am thankful to my co-authors. The first textbooks were co-authored with Mitch Newbert, and most recent with Aaron Kaza and Fred Starkey. The books have been very well received by other scholars, by instructors, and most importantly, by students. My students immediately recognized the benefits of using a textbook that presents more than one approach to management. This prompted me to research those benefits and present them to my colleagues. So with others, we published several empirical papers examining the effect of learning multiple approaches to management, each based on a different moral point of view. Whereas previous research suggests that business students and economic students tend to become more materialistic and more individualistic as they go through their programs of study because of the self-fulfilling prophecies embedded in their theory and course content, our students became less materialistic and less individualistic. And whereas other studies show that students' critical thinking ability often does not increase even after completing 4 years of university studies, our students had higher critical thinking ability after 1 semester. Over 90% of students believed that learning multiple approaches to management improved their ethical thinking. And more importantly, I think for us, 95% of students believe that teaching multiple approaches is more ethical than teaching only one approach. My favorite moments in teaching this class occur at the end of a semester when a student comes to me and says, "Bruno, I'm not an FBL manager, and I'm not a TBL manager, and I'm not a SET manager. Rather, this course has taught me to know what kind of manager I am. It's taught me to think about my moral point of view and what kind of person I want to become." My students have learned that management is not value neutral. They have been compelled to think about questions related to expanded reason, and in particular to consider how their personal values will influence what sort of manager they want to become, the being question. And just as importantly, they have implicitly learned the importance of treating with dignity other people who have different moral points of view and different approaches to management, sort of like forgiveness. In my remaining time, I will briefly describe how my innovations compel students to think about the 4 dimensions of expanded reason. First, in terms of anthropological questions, it's clear that SET management, whether being based on virtue ethics, has a different vision of humankind than FBL or TBL management, which are based on the view that individualism and self-interest are key to a flourishing society. The implications of these differing visions are spelled out in each chapter of the book, which encourages students to think about and freely choose which vision they want to choose. Second, in terms of epistemological questions, the book has much to say about how one measures what is truly effective management. Most management textbooks suggest that effective management can be measured in terms of quantifiably measuring an organization's efficiency or productivity or financial well-being. In contrast, SET management explicitly recognizes the importance of things that are difficult to quantify, like love and peace and joy, which are no less true or real than quantifiable measures. Third, my pedagogy is very rich in practical ethics, and in particular in operationalizing management ethics. Students who take my course know pretty well what utilitarian ethics look like in management practice, and what virtue ethics look like in management practice. They know how these ethics or moral points of view are operationalized differently in terms of management decision-making, in terms of entrepreneurship, organization structure and design, strategy, motivation, leadership, human resource management, organizational change, control, and so on. And finally, with regard to philosophical questions, every different approach to management has a different answer regarding the meaning of management, and by extension, the meaning of life. Indeed, the only management textbooks I know of that dare to ask the question, what is the meaning of life, are textbooks I've co-authored. These books provide a framework for students to think about what constitutes a truly meaningful life, and thus helps them to think about meaningful work and what sorts of managers they want to become. Let me conclude by thanking everyone associated with the Expanded Reason Awards for this honor. But more so, I also want to give my sincere appreciation for the overall work and agenda of Expanded Reason Congress, and for everyone attending this conference. As it states on the website, quote, "The Expanded Reason Awards want to foster a university that maintains and develops a sensitivity to truth that nests in the heart of every student, professor and member of that university community, so that reason does not succumb to the pressure of interests and the attractiveness of utility as the ultimate criterion of validity. This is a goal I've been proud to contribute to, and if in some small way my work helps others to contribute to it as well, I will be very pleased. Thank you and best wishes.
Thank you, Professor Bruno Dick. He was the recipient of the single teaching award this year, so we're grateful for your talk. The jury this year, as you know, selected this year it chose two works to be honorable mentions. One of which was not able to join us, Mary Hirschfeld. But we are very, very pleased to have with us Professor Andrew Briggs from Oxford, who is the other one that received it for his work on the book Penultimate Curiosity. Professor Briggs.
Well, thank you very much. You'll notice that I'm the odd one out today because I'm the only person without a script to talk from. And it's often observed that people in the humanities, when they're speaking, tend to write out what they're going to say with very carefully crafted language. And we scientists just sort of stand up with PowerPoint and blabber away. And it's been observed that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. I don't even have PowerPoint, though technology permitting, I'll show you a bit of a movie in a moment. I do experiments on the lab. I'd like to share a joy with you, if I may, because just today we learned that a paper we've been working on for a long time has been accepted for publication in one of the Nature journals. It's a paper looking at a new theory of how electricity flows through a molecule, a single molecule, one electron at a time. And we actually make measurements on individual molecules and how electricity flows through them. And the paper shows that the theory is correct. We've tested it, and it accounts for a phenomena that a lot of people had been puzzled about for a long time. And there's another paper that's coming out in a couple of weeks' time in another of the Nature journals, which is on how we actually use artificial intelligence in the lab, specifically machine learning, to decide what the next measurement should be. And it's the machine that decides, and the machine directly controls the experiment. And it's rather better at it than the graduate students. So we're very excited to implement in the lab some of the underpinning technologies and sciences that we're talking about in this Congress. The Penultimate Curiosity is a book that I wrote with the artist Roger Wagner. Rather remarkably, he and I each have a degree-level qualification in a subject other than the one in which we now earn our living. So Roger is an artist. He was described by Charles Moore in The Spectator as Britain's best living religious painter, for good reason. And Roger has a degree in English literature with first-class honours at Oxford. And I have the chair in nanomaterials at Oxford. It happens I've also got a degree from Cambridge in theology. So in this book, we're actually bringing together not just two disciplines, but 4 different disciplines. And the central metaphor of the Penultimate Curiosity is a slipstream. So think of a flock of Canada geese in a V formation, and the bird in front has to work hardest, but the birds following get an energetic advantage from the slipstream created by the vortices from the wings of the bird in front. And in fact, these birds are terribly clever. It's been studied in detail with the bald ibis. They not only find the best place, but they also find the best phase for flapping their wings to maximize the energetic advantage. And what we found as we looked into curiosity was that time and again it had been the case that where you have a culture or a community, or less often an individual, who's interested in the ultimate questions, questions about truth and meaning and purpose, and why we're here, and what humans are for, and what is God like, and how can he be known, time and again, that has proved conducive to the kind of curiosity about the material world that we now call science, and that I pursue in my laboratory. And I'm as well as having a degree in theology and doing a bit of science, I'm a pilot. After we'd completed the manuscript of the book and handed it in to OUP for production, we got into a plane and we made a movie about curiosity. And because Roger's an artist, we started off looking at curiosity even before the invention of writing, namely with cave paintings. And so I'll show you now a little sort of trailer for the movie with Spanish subtitles. And we pick up the story where Roger and I had been talking about inscriptions or sculptures on the front of a key building for science in Oxford, the Museum of Natural History, and a key building for science in Cambridge, the Cavendish Laboratory. And we're asking how the motivations for those invocations on the outside of those buildings were related to the motivations for the science that went on inside them. So if we can try and see if we can switch to the HDMI input and get the movie to work. Tell me when you're ready. Are you ready? Good. There we go. Let's see if it works. Let's see if the sound works.
In the book that Andrew and I read together, we trace these motivations as far back through history as we could go. And now we're going on a journey to explore some of the key places in the long and extraordinary story that we discovered. I can remember that in the 1990s, what people called the human revolution only happened when Homo sapiens migrated from Africa to Europe and started making paintings.
And what changed that was the discovery in the Blombos caves in South Africa of evidence that people were making symbolic markings 100,000 years ago.
I mean, in the newspapers they described it as the first artist studio, which I love, because they found these extraordinary abalone shells which were used for storing and actually mixing pigment.
Only last year in Indonesia they discovered evidence that when humans started to migrate from South Africa, one of the things they took with them was painting.
And the first European paintings were discovered just about the time we started writing this book.
Or at least thinking about it, yes.
Yeah. And that's where we're going now.
I like this!
This journey will take us across the world and across time. It will begin in France with that discovery of a vast complex of prehistoric paintings. Paintings that the leader of the excavations is convinced were religiously motivated.
We know they have a religious motivation, first because people didn't live inside those caves.
But paintings which also show an astonishing attention to anatomical accuracy.
Doing it with such accuracy might have been vital because they were recreating them.
It was made perhaps 35,000 years ago, and it's an astonishing piece of work. The journey will take us on to a city on the coast of eastern Turkey.
The ruins century BC, a new idea of the divine coincided with a new kind of interest in the natural world. From there we'll follow the route by which one man brought this idea to 5th century Athens.
I dare say you would refer to your work about the shadowing of the moons related to the sun. Yeah, he also said that the sun was not a god, but a fiery ball, which in 4th century Athens is a pretty controversial thing to say. Yeah, I think he was probably quite courageous.
And visited places where it provoked opposition and sparked a whole new way of thinking about the gods and studying the world. We will follow the path of these ideas to Alexandria in Egypt.
But what happened in this great multicultural city when the philosophical religion of the Greeks and the revealed religion of the Jews and Christians came into contact? Well, the answer was right.
But we will also see how in a newly discovered philosophical school, where Christians and pagans studied together, a Christian philosopher who insisted that nothing should get in the way of truth, anticipated one of Galileo's most famous observational experiments by almost exactly 1,000 years.
Two unequal weights dropped from a given height strike the ground at almost the same time.
Following this trail forward to the city of Pisa in the 16th century, we will discover how Galileo not only repeated that observation, but followed in that early Christian philosopher's footsteps in his conviction that pursuing truth as a Christian duty would reveal deep laws that govern the whole creation. Coming back to Oxford, we'll see how in the 17th century, religiously motivated natural philosophers sparked what we now call the scientific revolution. And finally, travelling first to Scotland and then to Cambridge, we will see how a 19th century scientist broke down 4 equations which showed that the whole universe was filled with the surge of electromagnetic waves.
Their description of the fundamental gearing between space and time led directly to Einstein's theories, but they also provide the basis for all the electronic technologies that shape the modern world. The world we live in today begins with these equations.
And we will see how for that 19th century scientist, the discovery of those 4 equations, which revealed the deep unity of fundamental aspects of the universe, was carried along.
Human beings seem to reach out beyond the horizon of the visible world in order to try and make sense of it as a whole. We could describe it as ultimate curiosity. If then our curiosity about the world around us moves, as it were, in the slipstream of that ultimate curiosity, you could describe it as penultimate curiosity.
We can have the lights back on. Thanks very much for showing the film. I think you can see how the penultimate curiosity is driven by the same criteria that drive Expanded Reason Award. It's a transdisciplinary approach. The questions we were investigating needed all of the disciplines that Roger and I were able to bring to the subject. It's motivated by an anthropological approach, because one of the things we're looking at is the way that the description of Homo sapiens has to be augmented by a description of Homo religiosus. It's driven by epistemology, because we're showing that the kind of curiosity that enables you to learn about the material world swims in the slipstream of the kind of curiosity that you need to address the ultimate questions. There's an ethical dimension because of, as you look at what we call the Garden of Eden. Is the microphone working correctly? Yeah. What we describe as the Garden of Eden moment in one of the chapters of the book. drives humans to this decision-making capability that is integral to the attribute of responsibility that makes people humans, and of course relates to the kind of questions about machine learning as a decision-making process that have been so much in the air in these last 2 days. And there's a synthesis of knowledge and the question of meaning. The book ends up with detailed case studies of Henry Ackland in Oxford, the man responsible for the Museum of Natural History, and James Clerk Maxwell, who was responsible for the building of the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge. And each of them was concerned with how scientific knowledge relates to philosophical questions of meaning. Now, this metaphor of the slipstream can also be applied to the peloton in a cycle race. So you have riders in a cycle race who want to get as close as they can to each other because of the very significant advantage that they get from the slipstream of the rider in front. And there are a couple of extra ways in which you can expand that metaphor. One of them is that occasionally in the cycle race, the cyclists get too close together. The wheels touch, and you get what in French is called a chute. When they fall over, it can be very painful and it's extremely disruptive. And although by and large the entanglement between science, what we now call science and what we now call religion, by and large it's been an extremely positive story, nevertheless there are occasions when the wheels touch. Intellectually, science tries to answer questions that really belong to religion, or vice versa. It's an epistemological muddle, and there can be a chute when everyone falls over and gets hurt. And you can think of 1 or 2 examples of that. Not many, actually, but 1 or 2. And then there's another useful part of the metaphor, which is, and the birds do this as well, but you see it very systematically in a cycle race, that because the cyclist in front is having to work harder, so they take it in turns and change who's pulling out at the front. And I don't know whether you think this is happening. I'm still trying to work it out myself. But it may be that currently we're in an era where more money is being poured into science than is being poured into philosophy and theology. More person years are going into it. And maybe that's moved out in front of the peloton at the moment. And that's okay, because the relationship still holds good. And it may be that actually some of these philosophical and theological questions that we want to study in the Expanded Reason Award are swimming in the slipstream of the questions that are being asked by science. That's something we've addressed in my next book, which is called It Keeps Me Seeking. And the central metaphor of that is that if you think of this material world in which we live as a house, and because we're curious people, we want to measure the house, understand how it works. We're material scientists, what's it made of? We're social scientists, how do people work in the house? And you study the house more and more until you discover there are windows. There are windows, and you can open them and look out through them and let the sunshine in and the breeze in. And these windows call you to a world beyond. And if you're trying to think of the relationship between science and the transcendent, so that metaphor of a house with windows calling you to a world beyond may be a helpful one. It's why I think the Expanded Reason Award is to be commended for expanding our reason to the world beyond. I congratulate you for it. It's the kind of thing that keeps me seeking.
Thank you, Professor Briggs. We have 30 minutes before we end this session, and what we wanted to do is to have a conversation now with our winners. The way I would like to propose is not so much to have, it is very easy to ask questions about very specific things, and then have a one-on-one conversation with each person. But that's not, I think, what would be nicer to do. I'll try to do something different. And that is to try to engage in a conversation where all of us can participate by asking not about the specifics. We've heard already about some of the specifics, and of course you can access their works elsewhere. But I would like to talk about what really unites us here, which is a community of learning, a university. We all have university experience. And I would like to talk about what it means to understand what is the value, how they perceive the value, and how we understand that which joins us here, and that is expanded reason. The concept that Pope John Paul II in Ex Corde Ecclesiae said that all truth in every field of knowledge culminates into the single truth, which is Christ. That the Catholic University in particular has a very privileged position, that is to seek the truth and to know that the truth has already found it. That we seek a truth that has already found us. Well, in each of our fields of knowledge, we participate in that quest for knowledge. And what unites us is in some way the realization that the university work that we do as professors and researchers has a profound meaning beyond the specifically technical aspects. And I think, for example, Professor Briggs, with his very technical work on quantum mechanics and quantum physics in the application of technologies, is of course highly specialized, yet he's got a profound interest in the ultimate questions, in that which unites all the human quest for human knowledge. Not just a university, anybody, any human. And similarly, in management, or the need for forgiveness and understanding, not just to forgive, but to understand the depth of what we need to do and to be, to understand forgiveness, or to be a manager. To be able to understand that in management you have to have a profound sense about the human community and not just self-interest. Or in also a highly complex and technical field, which is trying to unite all of cancer research into a synthesis that can help us move forward that field. It's done because we understand the need for humanity. So may I ask you to reflect a little bit on that which brings you to that area of expanded reason, that broadening of the horizon of reason, of which Pope Benedict taught us. The microphones are over there. There are two microphones, so if you can just go ahead.
Just
Yes.
following the order again.
I don't know if it's on. In any.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm really grateful, and just thinking of the previous presentation and of my own experience in the university as a student, as a researcher, and also as a teacher. I'm just thinking now that maybe the capacity of wonder is an interesting way. We can always adopt and increase and develop our capacity to wonder. Because the possibility, if I think of my own research, if I think of your work on curiosity, right, of your work on forgiveness, I think that human beings are really able to see something new, to see something good, where sometimes there is something that seems just to be obvious, trivial, not so important, not so relevant. And this is true if we think of science. There is something new to be discovered out there, and sometimes we don't train our students that way. We force them towards applications, right? Find out a concrete application of what you are doing, because we need technology, right? And definitely we can find something good and new, valuable in human beings and in ourselves. So to forgive ourselves, first of all, I was thinking while listening to your presentation, is another challenge and part of also just being free, right? Able to explore, to behave with a great freedom and therefore with a great responsibility too in our own fields. But that's my, yeah.
As you were talking, two thoughts came to me. One was, it's a bit ironic what we're doing in that we're all PhDs, and the joke in Canada at least is a PhD is somebody who knows more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing.
That's the professor.
That's the professor. And we are here saying we have our specialties and we teach specialties. It's a specialization world, right? And we're going against that and saying, no, we're curious about those other things out there. We're not satisfied with just this less and less. We want to understand this in a larger context. And the second thing is, oh, it's not up there now. I was thinking about the icon for the image for expanded reason, and I'm not sure what the picture of, but for me it's a picture of a dandelion. And what does that dandelion symbolize? Well, for me it symbolizes a weed. And what does the Bible say about weeds? Well, there's a classic verse about the mustard seed. So the mustard seed was a weed in the first century. Rabbinic tradition forbade the sowing of mustard seeds. This was a sin. This was a bad thing. But when I look at that when I look at that dandelion, I want to blow it, right? The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed that someone plants in the garden so that it can grow into a shrub so that the birds can find a perch. So these are farmers who are saying we're going to reduce the productivity of our land. We're not so interested about just being good farmers. We want to take care of creation. We want to take care of the larger world. We're willing to do this radical act. We're willing to go outside of what we're supposed to be doing in order for a larger understanding. And that's what the kingdom of God is like. So there's the two thoughts I had while you were talking.
Thank you.
I recently read a book by Edward Feser, F-E-S-E-R, called The Last Superstition. And he said the single most grave error in the Western world that has ever happened is the abandonment of Aristotle. I agree with him. And here's what he meant by that. Probably 90% of you in this room probably would not be able to pass a test on what a formal and a final cause are, because you have not had it in your education. A formal cause is simply what it is that you study. And most of us don't go in enough philosophical or theological depth to even know what we are studying. We don't know our concepts well. And a final cause is, to what does it point? To what does it point? So in my own case, forgiveness is not just saying, oh, it's okay. You have to go into the theology, the philosophy, and psychology to know what it is to love those who don't love you. And then you have to ask the final cause, to what does it point? It points to love, which is not material. There's something beyond material in love. So it really does point to something beyond our world. And I would challenge each one of you to start thinking in terms of formal and final causes of whatever you do. Brad, our keynote speaker yesterday, was basically talking about the abandonment of formal and final causes, right? With the idea of the Big Bang as an example. To what does that point? Well, it obviously points to something beyond the material, because there has to be something or someone to make the material. But the physicists don't think in terms of formal and final causes, so all they do is look at the material, see there's a Big Bang, and think they know everything about it. And if they would only ask about formal and final causes, they would think that they would have to conclude that the Big Bang is a huge deal, that physics cannot answer the why question. So why is there such a crying need for love, and why is love so important in this world? My studying forgiveness has pointed me to that final cause and made me take the idea of the Christian faith gravely, gravely, gravely seriously. So just the study of my own topic in academia usually drives you farther from God. Okay? I have found people who study, they go farther from God. Mine drove me closer to, because the notion of formal and final causes. Once I figured out what forgiveness is and what does it point, points to something profound called love. So that's my challenge to you. Let us bring Aristotle back into the conversation, whether it's physics, or whether it's marketing, or whether it's psychology, or whether it's ethics. Formal and final causes. Edward Feser is right. The abandonment of that is the greatest tragedy of Western intellectual thought.
Thank you. We have 2 microphones so that we can pass 2 of these here.
Well, this one's warm. It's
Go ahead,
nice. I love the way that the Expanded Reason Awards encourage a humility in the study of reality. I think a starting point, if you like, a starting point in understanding how to think about the relationship between science and faith is making the transition from thinking of God as a hypothesis to be tested to recognizing that God is a being to be known, with the emphasis on to be known. Let's not worry for a moment what we mean by a being. If someone asks the question, does God exist? They're almost certainly off to a false start. They're almost certainly got a muddled concept of God, which they think can be tested by microscopes and telescopes and the sort of instruments that I have in my laboratory. And whether or not that concept of God exists is really a pretty fruitless inquiry, because it's so inadequate. And the fruitful approach, I think it's the approach that's encouraged by Expanded Reason, is rather to ask the question, what can we learn about reality? I think it's got a particular poignancy just today, I mean literally today in the world, with this amazing set of demonstrations that are going on around the world about the environment, about the climate. And I think that as we learn more about God, so we have more and more to contribute to that kind of issue. I think we saw that happening with the 2015 Paris discussions, where it seems to me pretty clear that the Laudato Si and Pope Francis's approach on this helped an enormous number of people to take it seriously and to want to take action about that. And I think that we can move on, and we can engage with all these people who are demonstrating today, who care about these things, and say, yes, yes. And in Jesus Christ, we see God giving the ultimate dignity to the material world in which we live out our lives.
Thank you. Do we have a microphone? We do? So, if anyone would like to ask a question, si quieren preguntar algo, bienvenidos. Si no, seguimos con nuestra conversación.
En español, ¿no?
Sí, sí.
Vale. Tengo una pregunta sobre el forgiveness, sobre el perdón.
I will translate afterwards.
I can make it in.
I will-
I can make it in. I can make it in English. Yes, I got a question about forgiveness. I'd like to know if you have covered in your research something about the self-forgiveness, because we found many students coming into the university that we don't know why they are not maturing in the right way. Let's say like that, and we found at the end that they are not forgiving themselves, and they have something to be forgiven, and when they do it, they change and they open differently.
Self-forgiveness is controversial. Paul Vitz was right here yesterday talking about his new book, and he has a journal article saying there's no such thing as self-forgiveness. But I disagree with him, okay? He and I are friends, and so I'm gentle in my disagreement. But here's the gist of that. He says that you cannot be the defendant and the judge in a court of law. So you cannot say, I'm not guilty. And I say to him, but Paul, self-forgiveness does not take place in terms of jurisprudence or a court of law. It takes place in the individual human heart. And if forgiveness is a moral virtue, can we have moral virtues toward ourselves? Biblically, can we love ourselves? Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Can you be kind to yourself, patient to yourself? Yes. Therefore, if you can, it follows logically that you should be able to love yourself when you've broken your own standards, and therefore self-forgiveness exists. To make it even harder, St. Thomas Aquinas said that self-forgiveness is not a literal moral virtue. He said it's more of a metaphor. I had to study that and scratch my head. But I think what he meant, because he spent only a few lines on it, is that you can't forgive your own sins. And he's right. But can you welcome yourself back into the human community when you don't like yourself? Absolutely. So the great Thomas Aquinas, I stand on his shoulders. I stand on the shoulders of giants, as they used to say in the medieval times. So I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm saying maybe he didn't think that one through just a little bit more than he could have, okay? Forgive me, St. Thomas Aquinas, okay? But if that's true, then you and I ought to be able, when we break our own standards and we're resentful of ourselves, to be able to see our humanity, that we are more than that act, and welcome ourselves back into the human community by standing in the pain, having compassion on ourselves, and not taking it out on ourselves, which some people do. They subvert themselves. So I think self-forgiveness is very important. And even Mother Angelica, God rest her soul, from EWTN television, once used the term self-forgiveness, and I perked up, okay? So clearly I think there is such a thing. I think it is very important, and I would add one caveat. When you forgive yourself, you usually have to go to others whom you have offended by what you've done and seek forgiveness from them. See, when you're engaging in forgiving of another person, if you've done no wrong, you don't seek forgiveness. But usually in self-forgiveness, you welcome yourself back into the human community, you're good to yourself, you love yourself, which is biblical, and go to those you've hurt and seek their forgiveness.
I love that answer, and I understand the force of the question. I've never known a generation of students who's more stressed out than the current generation of students at Oxford. And we worry about it deeply. And so it's so important to take a question like that and to address it. But I'd love, if I may, from a personal viewpoint, to add an additional dimension, which is, there's an even more important question than can I forgive myself, which is the question, can God forgive me? And when people write Christian books about forgiveness, for example, like Desmond and Umpo Tutu, they talk about the example of Christ in forgiving, and what a wonderful example that is. But it seems as if from Christ's own teaching and from the teaching of the people immediately around him, it's more than that. It's much more than that. That Jesus Christ did something that was the channel for God to forgive us. And the central Christian belief is that that happened when he died on the cross. How it works, I mean, Paul in chapter 5, runs through about 4 metaphors in as many verses, wrestling with this question, how do we get to grips with how that forgiveness came about? But that it came about seems to be absolutely central. And if it's right, which I believe it is, then it transforms this meaning of the possibility and the reality of God forgiving us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentations. All your presentations make me think to the first presentation, Dr. Gregory, at the beginning of our amazing conference. So he mentioned the problems that we have with naturalism. It seems to me that all your work has shown that we are interconnected, but also we are spiritual beings. And you too mentioned the idea that forgiveness can heal us from even cancer. So you mentioned that, and my question is, do you have research that show that forgiveness, of course, right, but forgiveness also has that spiritual connection to healing? And do you have also research from people that they have religious, the grace of God, for example, right, that can forgive better, can heal better? Last week we have in our parish in the US a priest that someone was with cancer. They prayed to the Holy Spirit on top of that person, all the community. The news was that he was cured after 6 months of praying for him. But the revelation was that the last thing that this person was invited to do was to make a list of all the people that he has never forgiven in his life, and to pray during that time for these 6 months for each one of them in that list. And after the prayer, after that, himself praying for that lack of forgiveness, the cancer was cured. So that interconnection came for me when you were talking. So my question is, do you have that research?
We are just beginning that research. We are looking for funding and have not found it yet, but we do have case studies from Pavel Katochek from the United Kingdom, who is a physician, who screens people with multiple myeloma cancer so that he knows they have deep hurts that are unforgiven, that haven't forgiven the people, has them go through forgiveness, and their symptoms oftentimes level out. Another thing to keep in mind, you asked about the connection between forgiveness and spirituality. We have had discussions with the exorcist community in Manila, the Philippines, and they tell us that they first work on having those who are possessed to forgive those who've hurt them, because exorcism, they have found, does not work unless they forgive. Forgiving opens up the possibility of spiritual freedom from demonic possession. The closing down of the heart from that, they say they will not go forward with the exorcism without it. That pretty much shocked me, because it wasn't on my radar, so I'm glad you brought that up. So there's something very profound with those who are in the depths of the spiritual warfare that I never knew about. Forgiveness first and then the exorcism. Now we need the funds to, through the epistemology of science, to show through this multiple myeloma, that forgiveness matters through randomized experimental and control group clinical trials. The foundations think it's stupid because of the mind-body dualism. I'm working on forgiving those who keep rejecting us. Not there yet, but you never know.
Thank you.
Right here.
So coming back to the question of science and religion, that I think it's involved in the Expanded Reason Awards. I was thinking of a survey among scientists done by Elizabeth Eklund, I think in 2016. So
Put it more closer to your mouth, closer.
Yeah, most scientists in Western countries, they said, well, they are half religious than the society where they live. But the question is, when they are asked why, well, what do they think about science and religion? And they say, there's no problem. They work in two different spheres. And I was thinking about this because I think this is a failure for our expanded reason conception. And I was thinking about the metaphor of the slipstream because you mentioned that from time to time the wheels touch and then some disruption occurs. So how to do in order to engage scientists in this discussion, knowing that from time to time the wheels touch and there could be some disruption, but on the other hand, this touching is necessary because we are speaking about the one and same reality. So that's my question to all of you. Thank you.
Does anyone else want to try this before I do? Does anyone else want to chip in?
She'll speak, but go ahead, you go first.
You go first.
No, you.
If you want, I just have an anecdote that might be useful for this kind of, Just an anecdote. When I was, I don't want to tell you where, right? But I was working with philosophers, philosophy of science, of course. And it was, do you remember 2012? So December 2012. At that time, the world was supposed to end. Do you remember the calendar?
Mayan
story?
calendar.
Okay. So I was working with philosophers, and 2 days before, the director of the department came to me saying, I guess you are Catholic coming from Rome, the Assumption, right? Because of that. But so are you coming to the office on Friday? I say, of course. Is there any holiday or something? I'm missing something here. And he said, well, I'm maybe a little bit embarrassed, but I think that you will be alone because we wanted to stay at home with our families because the world was to end that day. So, well, I don't want to make a long story short, right? We started talking, and at the end, we really agreed, right, that many human beings actually always believe in something, right? And that if we don't believe, and we are not aware of that belief and faith, we end up believing in anything, right? So, and starting from that conversation, we were able to go back to philosophical issues like causality and God and the role of faith, precisely to open our mind, to open our reason, right, to different ways of understanding things and to make sense of different perspective approaches and blah, blah, the kind of talk. Just an anecdote, if it's useful.
I just, last month, I guess, I had a paper published on how my faith has influenced my scholarship. And by faith, it's not my belief so much, but my faith, but my relationship with the sacred. So for me, spirituality has three components. It's connectedness with others, connectedness with nature, and connectedness with the sacred. And there's research that goes along those lines in my discipline. I come from a religious faith perspective, and I have relationship with sacred, or I have moments where I'm connected to the transcendent other, and you realize love is important and compassion is important and making lots of money isn't that important. So I have those moments, but I also argue that most everybody does. And we don't name it maybe, we don't legitimate it, we don't validate it, but I think lots of people have those moments where they feel like they're part of something larger. And expanded reason can provide theory, provide a venue or a place for them to express those slipstream, those touching moments, I guess, those shoot moments.
Javier, thanks for that question. It was a very specific question, so let me give you a specific answer. I know the work of Elaine Howard-Eklund very well. I wrote the review as Book of the Week in Times Higher Education. And I've been responsible for funding some of her subsequent work. And I'll come back to that in a moment. This question of whether or not science and religion, how are they related, is a very subtle one. The best known exponent of there being no relationship between them is Stephen Jay Gould in a book called Rocks of Ages, which I also wrote the review for in Science and Christian Belief. And at first it seems terribly attractive, because here is one of the world's leading atheists saying, actually there's no problem, there's no conflict between science and religion. And you think, well, that's super, you know, leading atheist scientist says that, that's terrific. Until you get to grips with the detail of it. And in order for him to have what he calls his noma, his non-overlapping magisteria, he needs to exclude from science all questions of value. Well, maybe. But then he needs to exclude from religion all fact. So religion is not allowed to have any evidence in it at all. And at least those of us who are Christians have an evidence-based religion. So it's completely collapsed before, well, certainly before he's got to the end of the book, if not before he started. So now to come back, so it's a subtle relationship, and we want, the slipstream is positive, provided you don't get the epistemic confusion, which, if you accept the metaphor, I don't want to overpress the metaphor because that's all it is when we start expecting the intellectual tools of theology to give us answers about questions that really need the intellectual tools of the natural sciences, and vice versa. That's why we need expanded reason. And so now to come back to Elaine Howard-Eklund's observation from her data, that whereas only a minority of scientists would articulate a commitment to a religious community, so religious worship in a structured way, the majority would describe themselves as spiritual people. And you can interpret that negatively or positively. The negative interpretation is to say, well, you know, this is such wishy-washy language, you know, describing themselves as spiritual people. It really doesn't, you've no idea what they mean by spiritual. I tend not to take the negative approach, but the positive one. So I'm not being critical. I'm not saying you naughty, naughty people because you're being vague with your language, but to say, hey, that's great. You know, tell me what it is that makes you want to describe yourself as a spiritual person. What is it, if you like the metaphor of this book, that makes you aware of some windows in the house of this material world that we study by science? What is it that calls you out to the transcendent? Is it Bach's music? Is it some of the paintings in the Prada Museum here? You know, what is it that for you calls you out to something beyond the material world? Let's use that as common ground and see if we can explore it together and give it a sharper focus.
Thank you very much.
Could I just add just an encouragement? Let's use an analogy with the Berlin Wall and communism in Eastern Europe. You and I have lived through some of that, and it looked like the Berlin Wall would have been with us forever. And when it fell, we were all shocked. And so the truth of fides et ratio, with St. John Paul II tells us is the truth. right now we are in a spiritual war that dichotomizes faith and reason, and it looks like we're losing. Well, it looks like we were losing with the Berlin Wall, too, because people from East Germany couldn't come over to the West, and boom, it ended. Sometimes, and really at some point, evil collapses in upon itself. And if this is the truth that you are talking about, and we are losing the battle, think of the Berlin Wall. We're not going to lose the war.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Bertolaso, Professor Dick, Professor Enright, and Professor Briggs. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you, everyone. We will begin tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. You look out for your program to see where you should be going. Thank you very much.